We're pleased to have CW3 pilots Alex Malibu Grandahl and his colleague John Muttley, Behuniak, speaking tonight. Before they do, though, I'd like to have Alan, our chaplain. So if we could all rise, if you're able, for the opening prayer.
Oh, it beat me to it. I was going to say all stand. Most high and worshipful Father of us all, we thank you for bringing us together this evening in both friendship and fellowship. We're thankful for the day that you've given us, for its blessings and its opportunities. We also thank you for the gifts of unity, purity, valor and honor, and patriotism. We ask you to continue to bestow your grace upon us as we strive to embrace the best in each one of us. We ask all this in thy holy and ineffable name. Amen. Pledge allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen. Thank you, gentlemen. Be seated.
So again, we're happy to have Alex and John.
So I guess we'll start off by saying that we had a little bit of a powwow to figure out how we wanted to address this. No offense intended. We're not in the Air Force, so we're not super polished. So we don't have a good back and forth, and we don't want to tell one specific story. So what we were planning on doing is just telling you a little bit about ourselves, how we became Army aviators, and then John and I both deployed to Jordan, Iraq, Syria, and Kuwait in support of Operation Inherent Resolve, and Operation Spartan Shield. So we flew out of those 4 countries for the last year. We came back in February. So we're just going to give you a little run through of who we are, how we ended up in a cockpit, who let us do that, and then answer any questions, kind of have an open forum. So we'll start there. You want to
Sure.
introduce yourself?
Yep, I'm John McCallsign Muttley. I'm a CW3 in the United States Army out of the Connecticut Army Guard at Windsor Locks, Connecticut. We're both in Charlie Company, 3rd of the 142nd Aviation Regiment, and I've been in the Army for 16 years. I started out as a 15 Tango helicopter repairman, and I became a helicopter crew chief on my first deployment in 2009. After that, I realized, hey, I'd rather be flying. My grandfather was in the United States Air Force. He served in Korea, Vietnam, and the Cold War. He retired as a full bird colonel as the state aviation officer for the New York Army Guard. I applied to become a pilot, took the test, studied really, really hard, got great at PT, and just worked very hard, tirelessly, to show my leadership that I could be the ideal candidate to become a rotary wing pilot. Fort Rucker for me took about 18 months to get through, and I hit the ground running right when I got home. That's when Superstorm Sandy kicked off, and the Connecticut Army Guard with the Chinooks and the Blackhawks were called to assist New York and Long Island with the storm relief. It means a lot to be a guardsman, to help out my neighbors. We do firefighting training, we do search and rescue training, rescue hoist training, medical training. All year we train very hard to do that to support our state and our neighboring states as well. That's how I became a pilot. I came here a couple years ago, talked about my 2018 deployment. I was in the medevac unit, and when I got home, I got transferred to the air assault, or for the Vietnam guys, Air Cav, and that's when we got notification that we were going to deploy again, and our main mission was combat support, combat service support. Right now in Iraq, Syria, Jordan, it's mostly peacekeeping operations as far as providing security to the host nations. So we did a lot of work for that we'll get to later. And I'll pass it off to Alex.
Yep. CW3 Alex Grandahl, call sign Malibu. Both of us have stories for those call signs, which we could describe over a beer at some point. Not super interesting. It's just how we decided to name each other because it's easier to talk that way when we're talking internally than Chalk 1, Chalk 2. So I started flying actually on the civilian side first out of Northeast Helicopter. I got my private helicopter license and there was something missing, a sense of competition and being around the best. When I looked around and saw where's the best place you can go to be a military helicopter pilot, the Army jumped out at me. So I started the process, did the same tests and activities that John did, or Muttley did slightly after him. I've only been in for about 10 years. Went through the process. It was a long process for me with a lot of objection from the medical side and all these other things. And I had to know for a fact that that's what I wanted to do. So I just persevered and eventually walked up across the stage at Fort Rucker. From the moment I walked into a recruiter to graduating in Fort Rucker, and I haven't done any other job in the United States Army other than being a warrant officer and pilot, was a 5-year process. So it was a long process to decide to prove that that's where I belonged. Again, selected the Black Hawk just like Muttley over here. Came back, I've been in Charlie 3142, Air Cav, Air Assault, whatever you'd like to call it, my entire career. And this deployment that we just went on was my first, and with any luck, my last. So I've loved every minute of it. What John didn't describe is John is an SP, so it's a standardization pilot, so he is our head instructor pilot in Charlie 3142 and now the state, correct? Battalion. So next higher echelon, John is the standardization pilot for that. And then I am a baby instructor pilot, so my job is to take the junior guys out just like John does and get them ready for whatever mission we're supposed to do. And then we were both aviation mission survivability officers, which is kind of like weapons and tactics. So that's a long acronym for just relatively simple title and a very complex job. So last year, in February, we were NOSed. So we were sent out, we were mobilized, and we flew down to Texas from Windsor Locks. We went down with all five aircraft, and we had 2 months in Texas locked down at North Fort Hood, which is now Fort Cavazos, of training and prepping to go overseas. So that's an additional on top of that 9 months that we spent overseas, and that was just designed to get us ready and make sure we were all on the sheet of music. The way the National Guard works is we don't deploy with just our state, we deploy with a bunch of other states. Half of our company for Charlie 3142 is out of Maine, so there's an entire detachment of 5 other aircraft and the required air crew and personnel out of Maine that we work with here and there. We did a lot more training with them in the last year than we normally have. So we all descend on Texas and everybody's got to figure out how to interact and work on the same page and speak the same music or speak the same language. So our battalion was from Mississippi, our brigade was from Mississippi, and the battalion was from Illinois. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of cultural differences in that. So that 2 months was designed to get us all working together. And it was, John and I had a blast because we flew more than anybody else down there. John, I think in 2 months flew 90 some odd hours. 130, and I was in the high 80s. So, and it was every night, double periods, doing training in the afternoon, debriefing, suiting up, and then going back out for training. And then we started getting into mission-orientated training with active duty Army. So they had basically chaperones, cadre that came in, and they would assign us missions just to see how we functioned as a team. And then they would grade us and critique us as we went through. So that was what we had to look forward to for the first 2 months. Texas and then Oklahoma, we went to Fort Sill as well, and basically set it up as an analog between one site would be Kuwait, one site would be a site in Iraq or Jordan or wherever, and then we did our combined arms in that way. So, do you have anything to add about Fort Hood?
When we got assigned our second platoon out of Maine, that was about 6 months prior to mobilizing down to Fort Hood. From that time until the last flight that we had bringing our helicopters to port to get loaded on a boat, our unit flew 3,416 hours. We had 44 aircrew members assigned to us, and that's a lot of tasking, a lot of work spread out for everybody. While in combat, we flew 2,281 hours, and we transported we approximated at 1.2 million pounds of cargo. That's everything from mortars to people's bags, vaccines, etc.
Animals.
We're going to get there. Because of the nature of the mission, medevac was a high priority, and they were understaffed. So many of our aircrew members had to double, not just doing air assault or combat service support missions, but they also did medevac as well. Our specific air crews saved 146 lives. We also transported 2 cats and 3 dogs to the SPCA, and they all are at loving homes in the States now.
One of them is at my house. A cat, and my wife is really happy about that, by the way.
And we had 2 pretty bad incidents while we were there, so our unit also assisted executed the personnel recovery of downed aircrew. An AH-64 ended up crashing in central Syria, so we had to go pick them up. The train-up was really stressful, and one of the things that made it so successful was everybody wants to give all the kudos to the leadership, the brass, the colonel, the light colonel, but it was really those E2s, E3s, E4s working on the aircraft every single day, making sure they were safe to fly, making sure that we had gas every time that we needed it, and making sure that the control tower, the ranges, everything was set up to give us the best chance of success. If any one of those individuals decided that they wanted to sleep in, they didn't want to cut the mustard that day, we would have shown up and we would have not been able to get gas at the FARP. Our helicopters would have been broken. And that's what, really made the mission happen. And those are the guys that don't really get the recognition that they deserve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to John's point, we have the fortune of being in the Rockstar job, where being at the front of the Black Hawk is where the focus generally is. But like he said, none of that would have happened without that. And even for the front seaters, we went down there with 3, just from Connecticut, 3 pilots that had just come out of flight school, which in some ways did them a huge disservice because they didn't have the time to do all the training back home. They got hit with a fire hose by myself, by Muttley, by some of the other instructors that were out there, and they had to quickly find their feet and meet us at a certain level. And I don't envy them for that. I wouldn't have wanted to go through my progression like that, because you basically come out of flight school with the ability to fly the aircraft vaguely, and that's it. And then we have to take them all the way to being able to do the mission tasks in day, night, under night vision goggles, regardless of what the weather is, and also be those professional aviators to recognize, even if you're in combat, there are still times when you should make that decision not to go. Yes, that might get shifted slightly if somebody's life is in danger and there's a safe way to execute the mission, but there's no point in putting 5 aircrew members at risk to save 1 life, right? To ball up an aircraft and to take out those 5 people because you made a bad decision, and that's what we're ultimately supposed to be doing as pilots in command, and then by effect, the junior pilots are starting to get into that decision-making process as well, to be able to hold up their hand if one of us in a more senior position says, hey, we're going, for them to hold their hand up and say, I don't feel comfortable going. And that's the same thing for the backseaters, our door gunners and crew chiefs, and then maintenance personnel. If the aircraft isn't ready to fly, I don't want them to release the aircraft to me just because I'm putting pressure on them as a CW3. So as John said, it was a huge group effort that fortunately we can say today that we brought everybody that we left with home in one piece. There were some closer calls than not, mostly on the ground. We'll get into those specifics in a little bit here, but as you can imagine, there was kind of 2 different deployments over this last year. There was a slower pace at the start of it, the first 6 months, and then once October came around and the Israel-Hamas conflict kicked off, that really spiced up our lives in Iraq and Syria. So it became a little bit more aggressive from October until we left in January. So it was definitely a tale of 2 deployments. I think in some ways it was fortunate because we were able to take some of those stumbles when we first got into country in a more controlled environment. So by the time things started getting more aggressive, we had been there for 6 months, we were all in a battle rhythm, and everybody knew their place and knew their job, and we didn't have any single person that was not valuable. Everybody figured out where they belonged and what they needed to do to get everybody home. So I'll just dovetail into my experience. Muttley and I were in 2 different places the entire deployment, with a couple of weeks here and there where I would go up. We would weasel me going up to fly with each other. Muttley and I love flying with each other, so generally we're separated for that reason. So especially in that theater, they could separate us by hundreds of miles. So I started my deployment in Jordan on the border of Syria, which up until a couple of months ago, I wouldn't have been able to tell you where that was, but unfortunately it was just in the news. It was called Tower 22. It's still there. That's where those 3 service members died recently due to a drone attack. That's where I started my deployment. I was there as the sole air assault representative with my co-pilot, my 2 backseaters, my 2 door gunners and maintainers, and our 1 air assault aircraft. And we were there to support the medevac, doing med chase. So as you can probably imagine, or you probably already know, medevac aircraft with the big red cross on them are not allowed to be armed. So they are going in specifically to save lives and bring them to the next higher level of care. So off the battlefield or patient transfers from one field hospital to the next higher level of care. And our job was to be there to provide some sort of protection, because we are, as air assault, we are allowed to be armed. We're not armed to the level of going out and picking a fight ourselves. We are there completely to be defensive and to keep people's heads down long enough that we can egress and get everybody out safely. I spent 3 months at Tower 22. There's a different culture between air assault and medevac, so there was a little bit of growing pains there on how we function and how they function. Again, like I said, they're focused on saving lives, and sometimes as an air assault pilot, we do a lot more deliberate planning. So they get the call, this is where you're going, and within 15 minutes they have to be off the ground and headed that way, right? Air assault, we do everything deliberately. When we get a plan, it could be up to 72 hours out, ideally no less than 48. That happens occasionally, but we plan everything based on time to the nth degree. So our plan is got all the contingencies. What happens if this happens? What happens if this aircraft breaks or this pilot gets sick? All of that needs to be planned. So we're a lot more deliberate. So when you put those 2 units together with different ways of operating, there's going to be some tension. And they both, what I learned is there's things that they can learn from each other, right? We don't always have to be so deliberate, because you can't wait 48 hours before you save a life, especially if they're in danger at that moment. But we also are looking at the bigger picture. So there was times where I could say, hey, time out. We're rushing into this, and we're rushing in a way that we don't need to. So there was some learning experiences there, and then I had the good fortune of, at Tower 22, there was also the Air Force CSAR guys, which is Combat Search and Rescue. They fly UH-60 Blackhawks, a different version, and they've got all sorts of swoopy things on it, like aerial refueling, things that we don't do because we don't have the hardware for it. And they adopted me like a stray cat. So I spent a lot of time with the Air Force guys. And their weapons officer took me under his wing, was super helpful with me, and helped teach me, helped fill in the gaps, and then I was able to fill in some of the gaps from the Army side. So I had a great working experience with them, and we actually got it approved by the commander of CJTF, which is the task force that's over there. So a 2-star general approved myself and one of the Air Force aircraft to actually fly in formation together into Syria to do a gunnery mission. At a place called ATG, which is in Syria, which is the first time that an Air Force and Army training mission has gone out in that country, as far as I know, ever. Air Force and Army work together when there's an actual mission, but they don't do training missions together. So that was a huge hurdle to overcome, and it was great for both of us, built a lot of morale, and then got some really good training out of it. So like I said, I spent 3 months there. And then I moved on to Baghdad. So I moved over to Baghdad, where the majority of our job was moving VIPs to and from Baghdad International Airport to the Baghdad Embassy Complex, the BEC, and then around the theater as necessary. So I'll fill that in after, I'll let Muttley talk for a little while.
I was one of the first people from our brigade to step foot into the Middle East for this rotation. My commander said, hey, we got to support this remote site out in Syria, and you're familiar with the area from your last tour. You're a previous medevac pilot, so you're going to help the medevac stand up their operations in Shadadi, Syria. Just like any large organization merging of different personalities and everything, there was a lot of issues getting everything logistically into country. The HH-60s, the medevac aircraft, were delayed, leaving Texas, then leaving port and getting into country. So the air assault unit had a huge task of providing the combat support and providing CASEVAC operations in theater until the rest of the aircraft could show up. The medevac were supposed to have 15, and they started with 6, and they finally got all 15 into country. It was a really, really unique experience being able to assist a captain to say, hey, you've never deployed, sir. This is how everything's going to run. This is how our talk is going to be set up. This is what we're going to do in the event of a 9-line call, etc. Being in Shadadi, it was really, really close to a Syrian village. It bordered right up to it. So we also had to provide our own base security, which was something that, as a warrant officer, I never thought I'd be doing. I'm supposed to be sitting back on a couch watching TV and eating my Oreos after a mission. Life is supposed to be really gravy as an aviator. It worked out really, really well. We ended up linking in with some special forces to provide base security, and then regular Army infantry were able to do that. From there, once operations were sustained and the medevac took over that mission, I went to northeast Iraq in the city of Erbil. Our base is right located on the international airport. From there, we just did combat support, combat service support missions, which were between 6 and 8 hours long every day. We had 4 aircrew members, or 4 complete air crews, and we never left without two Blackhawks flying. We quickly became the most reliable asset in theater. We would steal Air Force missions, we would take missions from Chinooks, and we would often fly twice a day, which is a huge, huge tribute to the maintainers who kept those aircraft flying. When a helicopter's flying 16 hours in a day, in between missions they have to do 4 hours of maintenance to get that aircraft ready to go. And then the next air crew is flying that until 2 or 3 in the morning. And once we put the blade ropes on and the inlet plugs on, those mechanics are right on top of that aircraft with flashlights and headlamps, getting it ready for a 7 o'clock mission. They worked around the clock, 365 days a year to provide all the necessary supplies, equipment, and manning for approximately 14 remote outposts that we serviced in Syria and northern Iraq. That's pretty much the gist of it. Some of the fun stuff we got to do was we did end up getting to fly together, which was great. It's a lot of fun anytime you get to fly with your best friend, and it's something that not a lot of people get to do, is serve as a brother in arms with somebody that you drink beers with regularly. You know their wife, you know their mom, and it's a huge, huge pride that I have to be able to do that. One of the things that we did was, where we were in northeast Iraq, it was primarily managed and governed by the Kurdish government, so it was very safe. And we set up a high altitude training site. You have the Korak Mountains just northeast of there that go 13,700 feet up, and flying when it's 55 degrees Celsius or 138, 145 degrees Fahrenheit, our aircraft have very poor performance. And we would set up these training sites so that the junior aircrew members, we ended up having 6 pilots straight out of flight school, and teach them power management. How do you fly the aircraft when it's at maximum gross weight and you don't have the option to not land or do a go around? And the first time in there is your only time in there. And we did an excellent job training for a very, very safe and highly functioning detachment up there. Another mission that we ended up having was the civil affairs. We're trying our hardest to get the Iraqis to take over their country, take over their security. And oftentimes you'll have to bring somebody to a location to talk with the elders in a town or a city government or something like that to understand why would they go to ISIS for help instead of the U.S.? Why aren't they solving the problem themselves? And their culture is a lot different than ours, where it's a very tribal mentality, and trying to get them to understand that this is your area, you're responsible for everybody in here, and you can't just let the Iranians or ISIS or anything like that come in here and take over your area, because then you're not in control anymore. You're not in charge, and you have to live the way that they want you to. The Kurds were great. It's mostly a Christian area. They've got about, I want to say, 80,000 Christians living there, and there's no feud between Islam and Christianity up there, or Judaism or anything. They recognize themselves as independent. It's actually becoming a technological area where they have schools that Europeans go to. And it's really, really neat to see from my first tour in 2009 to now how far they've gone. The city looks very similar to New York City now. Skyscrapers, modern roads, modern transportation system.
Neon lights.
And it's absolutely incredible to where they've come. And I take a lot of pride in when I first got there in 2009 when I was 20 years old to now. It's incredible what they've been able to do with all the adversity, especially where their neighbors want to bomb them every single day. It's something that we don't get to live here, thankfully. We're in the best country in the world, and it's very safe because of people like you who paved the way for us.
Yeah, so one of the things that I was talking to a couple of you before this is a lot of what we do in the Army now as air assault pilots and medevac and all of those things are holdovers from Vietnam and Korea. So we stand on the shoulders of those guys that came before us. They set the standard. They set the standard for bravery, how we do our mission, all of those things. And the way I know Muttley and I, we've talked about this, the way that we look at it is we wouldn't be here and we wouldn't have gotten through that deployment safe if those guys didn't come before us. We've had some good fortune to meet a lot of those guys, both front seat, back seat, ground pounders, doesn't matter, and I don't say that derogatorily. Sorry, that's just an aviation holdover. And the stories that they tell are truly inspiring. And like I said, we wouldn't be able to do what we do safely without having them go before us. What Muttley was talking about with the Kurds, it's actually really interesting. I don't think I'm out of line. I think I read this somewhere. I don't have a source for you, but I believe the Kurdish people are the largest ethnic group in the world without their own country. So it is a very different environment, even just crossing the borders in Iraq. So like I said, I spent the last 6 months of my deployment in Baghdad, which is a fully Arab and ethnically Iraqi kind of city. And I say kind of because Iraq was built, the borders were drawn in the 1940s by the British. And one of the issues that I saw, I was fortunate to be there in support of the diplomatic mission with the Department of State. So we worked hand in hand with them while they're doing their diplomatic mission and trying to, as Muttley said, get Iraq to take control of their country. They claim that they're sovereign, and how do they protect that sovereignty? The problem is when you draw that border in that area, you're drawing that border around a bunch of tribes that for thousands of years haven't liked each other, and now you're saying you're all Iraqi. So you've got some of those tribes that, like, what does that mean? Because I've known this tribe over here for 2,000 years, and I haven't liked them for 2,000 years, so just because you drew a border and you said that we're both the same, we're not the same. And that's where a lot of that conflict comes in. Even with what we would call our enemies over there, those little, we call them IAMGs, Iranian Aligned Militia Groups, they don't even like each other for the most part. So they're not working in the same direction, they're just kind of sponsored by Iran. So they don't work together, which is really good for us because it makes them a lot weaker if they're not working together and they're specifically going against each other. And some of them don't even listen. Some of them listen to Iran a little bit more than others. So Iran could tell them don't shoot anything, and some of the groups won't. Other groups will say we don't really care. We're going to do what we want. Thanks for the money and the arms. So it's a really interesting environment. But to Muttley's point, the difference in just physically what Baghdad looks like compared to Erbil, it's night and day. Baghdad is what you would expect from a Middle Eastern city. It's all concrete. It's not particularly pretty. There's a lot of pollution. They're always burning trash. So there's always this gray smog that's over the city in the summer. And then you fly up to Erbil, and it looks like something that you would potentially see in the United States with brand new buildings that are all glass. There's a lot of neon lights. So it's kind of strange, the duality of that between going from Baghdad, and they're only roughly an hour and a half flight in a Black Hawk from each other. So it's really interesting, that environment, and then and then you fly to the west of the country, and it's all desert and tribes, and driving around and herding goats, and you're flying along low level, and at the last second you have to do a zoom climb because there's a herd of goats and you don't want to
Piss the shepherd off.
piss the shepherd off and make another enemy.